A single drop of blood staining the concrete of an otherwise pristine front porch, and a dark glove discarded precisely to... The authorities know someone took her, but the agonizing reality is the absolute silence that immediately followed the crime. They were hoping for a simple explanation. They were praying for a visual confirmation of a medical transport or a confused, wandering episode. What they discovered instead was a chilling confirmation of their absolute worst fears. The doorbell camera system mounted directly above that terrible bloodstain had indeed captured a crucial sequence of events. Law enforcement eventually released a single terrifying still image from that footage to the public. The photograph showed a distinct and ominous figure standing right on the porch in the darkness. The person was heavily obscured, deliberately wearing a mask to hide every single identifying facial feature. This was not a blurred shadow moving quickly past the lens. This was a clear, undeniable image of an intruder standing at the threshold of a vulnerable woman's home. The presence of the mask elevated the entire investigation into a new category of premeditated crime. It proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the perpetrator had arrived with a specific, dark intent and a comprehensive plan to evade identification, who targets a frail 84-year-old woman who struggles with basic mobility. The footage was terrifying, but it was also incredibly frustrating because the mask worked perfectly. It hid the age, the gender, and the distinct features of the person who took Nancy away. The investigators had a picture of their suspect, but they had absolutely no idea who was underneath the disguise. This digital phantom had simply walked onto the porch, snatched an 84-year-old woman, and vanished into the Arizona night without leaving a trail, or so they thought. The problem with meticulously planned crimes is that adrenaline often overrides logic during the escape. While the immediate crime scene was heartbreakingly clean, the broader perimeter held a critical secret exactly 2 miles away from the quiet house in the Catalina Foothills. Law enforcement made a stunning discovery that blew the forensic investigation wide open. Discarded along a potential escape route, investigators located a pair of gloves. These were not just random pieces of winter clothing dropped by a careless jogger. When forensic analysts compared the physical characteristics of these recovered gloves to the high-definition images captured by the doorbell camera, they found an exact match. What could a perpetrator possibly gain by kidnapping someone so physically vulnerable when the risk of the captive dying in their custody is phenomenally high? The gloves found 2 miles down the road were identical to the ones worn by the masked figure standing on the porch. This physical evidence was an absolute goldmine. It meant the suspect had shed a layer of their disguise while fleeing the area. It meant that somewhere along that specific 2-mile radius, the perpetrator felt safe enough or rushed enough to roll down their window and throw away critical physical evidence. But finding the gloves immediately generated a completely new set of agonizing questions. Why discard the gloves so close to the scene? Was the suspect switching vehicles? Was the drop point a calculated misdirection to throw the police off their actual escape trajectory? The suspect had proven to be incredibly disciplined at the house, ensuring their face was covered and leaving almost no trace inside the residence. So why make such a careless amateur mistake just a few minutes down the road? The discovery of the gloves proved that the suspect was fallible. The clock is relentlessly counting down her chances of survival. It proved they were human and capable of making critical errors under pressure. But it also proved that they were moving incredibly fast and putting distance between themselves and the crime scene. The masked figure had a 2-mile head start and an unknown destination in mind. They left behind a chilling photograph and a pair of gloves, but they took the only thing that actually mattered. The authorities now had a physical piece of the phantom, but the silence surrounding the victim was growing more deafening by the minute. If you want to make sure you never miss a deep dive into forensic behavioral analysis like this, hit the notification bell right now so you are always alerted when we drop a new case file. The physical clues were secure in the evidence lockers, but the most dangerous phase of the investigation was just about to begin. The forensic laboratory processed the swab collected from the concrete surface with maximum priority. They knew that the results would fundamentally dictate the entire strategy of the ongoing search. Every single hour that passes without her necessary medication pushes the boundaries of human endurance to the absolute limit. The scientific confirmation arrived quickly, and it officially extinguished any lingering desperate hope that the stain belonged to an injured animal or even the suspect themselves. The DNA analysis definitively matched the blood on the porch to Nancy Guthrie. This irrefutable scientific fact meant law enforcement was officially dealing with an injured hostage who was 84 years old and completely deprived of her daily medical support system. The behavioral science units analyzing the case profile were forced to confront a deeply unsettling reality about the kidnapper. Most kidnappings for ransom are highly transactional crimes. The perpetrator views the victim strictly as a valuable asset that must be kept alive long enough to secure a massive financial payout. Keeping a hostage alive requires secure logistics. It requires providing food, water, shelter, and most importantly, maintaining the victim's basic health. By targeting an elderly woman who required a strict regimen of daily prescriptions, the kidnapper was operating on an incredibly compressed timeline. The physical deterioration of the victim would begin almost immediately. If you want to uncover the forensic truth behind crimes like this one, hit subscribe to Ellis Case Reports right now. The profilers knew that this extreme medical vulnerability made the crime exceptionally dangerous. If the kidnapper's sole motive was financial extortion, they had chosen a target whose health could rapidly collapse before any ransom negotiations could even properly begin. It suggested a terrifying level of either incompetence or a calculated, ruthless indifference to human life. The suspect either did not care if she survived the ordeal, or they falsely believed they could extract millions of dollars within mere hours of the abduction. This blatant disregard for the biological realities of an 84-year-old captive terrified the entire investigative command structure. They knew that if the kidnapper was an amateur who panicked when the medical crisis inevitably began, the victim might have been immediately abandoned in the harsh Arizona desert. Conversely, if the kidnapper was a hardened professional, they might view any sudden medical emergency as a complete operational failure and take drastic, immediate action to eliminate the physical evidence of their botched extortion plot entirely. As the days stretched into weeks without a single verified sighting, the intense pressure on the investigative teams grew exponentially heavier. We strip away the online conspiracies and focus entirely on the verified physical evidence to understand how these predators operate in the real world. The local community was paralyzed by fear, while the national media spotlight intensified with every passing news cycle. Recognizing that the silence needed to be broken, the family took an extraordinary public step to force the kidnapper out of the shadows. On February 24, 2026, they officially announced an unprecedented $1 million reward for information leading to her safe return. Putting $1 million on the table completely changes the dynamics of any criminal investigation. It is designed to shatter loyalties among criminal associates and tempt anyone with peripheral knowledge to quietly contact the authorities. The massive sum was a desperate, aggressive maneuver intended to generate actionable leads and force the hand of the perpetrators. It was a clear message broadcast across national television networks, signaling that the family was willing to pay heavily for her life. Investigators braced themselves for the inevitable flood of tips, hoping that the enormous financial incentive would finally pierce the veil of secrecy surrounding the masked figure from the doorbell camera. They desperately needed that money to buy them a credible witness or a confirmed location. We are going straight into the heart of a timeline that defies all logic. The reward money did exactly what it was designed to do by generating massive public attention. But dropping a $1 million bounty onto the internet is like throwing raw meat into shark-infested waters. It does not just attract people who want to help. It acts as a massive glowing beacon for opportunistic predators completely disconnected from the actual physical crime. The authorities wanted a phone call from someone who recognized the discarded gloves or the specific gait of the person in the security footage. They wanted a tip from a neighbor who saw a suspicious vehicle speeding away from the Catalina Foothills. Instead, the physical quiet of the local Arizona crime scene was suddenly violently shattered by a chaotic storm of digital data. The investigators were about to learn that the only thing more dangerous than a cold trail is a trail that has been intentionally poisoned by highly sophisticated interference. The massive reward had successfully broken the terrible silence that had plagued the case since February 1st. We will examine the forensic significance of that bloodstain on the porch, the exact escape route, the suspect, but the voices reaching out from the digital darkness were not bringing salvation. They were bringing an entirely new form of psychological torture that would twist the investigation into an unrecognizable shape and test the limits of the federal agents tasked with finding the truth. The agonizing wait for contact was finally over, but the digital nightmare was just beginning. The introduction of a massive financial incentive fundamentally altered the trajectory of the search. Almost immediately after the family broadcasted their desperate plea for help, newsrooms and media outlets across the country began receiving a disturbing series of electronic communications. These were not handwritten letters or standard phone calls. They were sophisticated digital messages sent from encrypted accounts demanding payment in cryptocurrency. The senders specifically requested Bitcoin. This choice of currency is highly revealing from a behavioral perspective. Cryptocurrency offers a layer of anonymity that traditional bank transfers simply cannot match. Utilized to dump their gloves and the chilling psychology of an intruder who preys on the defenseless, it allows an extortionist to operate from anywhere on the globe, hiding behind complex strings of digital code, rather than walking into a physical bank branch to withdraw cash. For the federal agents working around the clock, this sudden influx of electronic demands created an absolute logistical nightmare. They were suddenly forced to shift massive resources away from the physical streets of Arizona and dive into the murky depths of the dark web and encrypted email servers. Every single message had to be meticulously analyzed. The agents needed to determine if the author of the email was the same individual who stood on that concrete step in the dead of night, or if they were dealing with an entirely different kind of predator altogether. The period between late February and early April became a grueling endurance test for everyone involved. The media outlets receiving these terrifying messages forwarded them directly to the federal task force. Miles away are the only tangible fragments left behind after a masked shadow moved across the lens of a doorbell camera. A masked suspect materialized from the darkness and executed a highly coordinated kidnapping in a seemingly impenetrable neighborhood. The emails contained specific violent threats and detailed instructional demands for the cryptocurrency transfer. But in the high-stakes world of crisis negotiation, words are completely meaningless without corroborating evidence. The federal agents scrutinizing these digital demands were looking for one specific thing that stubbornly never materialized. They were searching for a verifiable sign that the sender actually had physical control of the hostage. They needed a current photograph, a specific piece of undisclosed personal information, or a direct vocal communication from the captive herself. Without that critical verification, an email demanding cryptocurrency is just a sequence of pixels on a screen. Yet the sheer volume of these hostile messages created an unbearable psychological weight on the investigating team. The authorities knew that ignoring even a single communication could be a fatal mistake if it happened to be authentic. They were trapped in a relentless, vicious cycle of receiving a threat, tracing the digital footprint, analyzing the syntax, and ultimately hitting a frustrating dead end. The timeline was stretching dangerously thin. They left behind a terrifyingly clean scene. But a clean scene is never truly empty. Weeks slowly turned into agonizing months, and the physical trail left behind at the residence was growing colder by the minute, while the digital trail was multiplying exponentially. The extortionists clearly understood the immense emotional pressure the family and the local authorities were operating under. They deliberately weaponized the intense public interest surrounding the prominent case, using the constant national news coverage as a psychological lever to aggressively increase their demands. The emails were purposefully designed to induce sheer panic and force a rapid financial transaction before law enforcement could fully trace the complex origin of the encrypted messages. But the sharp federal analysts eventually began to notice a distinct behavioral pattern in the language and the precise timing of these electronic communications. The aggressive demands completely lacked the intimate physical knowledge that a true captor would absolutely possess. The senders relied heavily on secondary information that was already publicly available through televised press conferences and online news articles. This subtle but crucial discrepancy began to fundamentally shift the entire focus of the intensive digital investigation. The answers are buried in the few physical traces that remain, and we are going to follow the evidence exactly where it leads. The experienced agents realized they might not be actively negotiating with the original architect of the violent abduction. They were potentially dealing with an opportunistic digital parasite who viewed a devastating tragedy of a vulnerable family not as a horrific crime, but as an incredibly lucrative, low-risk business opportunity. The relentless digital communications were effectively functioning as a massive smokescreen designed to deeply confuse the fall authorities and extract a massive financial payout without the sender ever actually stepping foot inside the state of Arizona. The tension within the primary command center reached a critical breaking point as the cyber division prepared to execute a highly complex technical operation to definitively identify the source of these relentless threats. They had to carefully navigate the intricate global networks of offshore cryptocurrency exchanges and masked internet service providers to successfully unmask the unseen individual who was terrorizing the traumatized family from behind a computer keyboard. The investigation was rapidly hurtling toward a massive confrontation, but the cold reality of this investigation will force us to question everything we know about neighborhood safety and the true motives of those who hide behind masks. Finally uncover would only serve to deepen the profound mystery surrounding the actual physical disappearance. As the specialized cyber division aggressively zeroed in on the primary suspect, sending the most aggressive threats, the terrible reality of the situation became terrifyingly clear. Tell us your theories on how digital anonymity changes the landscape of modern forensic investigations in the comments below. The sudden breakthrough in the complex digital manhunt did not come from a dramatic tactical raid in the desert, but from the meticulous unraveling of complex internet protocols located thousands of miles away. Federal authorities officially accused a man named Derek Colella, residing in California, of orchestrating the absolute cruelest aspect of this entire protracted ordeal. He was not a hardened, violent kidnapper running a sophisticated underground hostage ring. He was allegedly operating entirely behind a computer screen, maliciously exploiting the massive national media attention strictly for his own personal financial gain. When the federal indictment finally dropped, the stunning revelation sent massive shockwaves through the dedicated true crime community and completely reshaped the entire narrative of the ongoing investigation. Nancy Guthrie lived a life defined by physical limitations but surrounded by an invisible aura of extreme high-profile status. The legal authorities explicitly detailed how Colella allegedly crafted the terrifying anonymous emails aggressively demanding Bitcoin, deliberately sending them to prominent national news organizations to strategically maximize the devastating psychological impact on the vulnerable family. He systematically manufactured an incredibly cruel, false sense of hope and absolute terror simultaneously. This calculated manipulation was the ultimate horrific betrayal of the general public trust. The entire Joint Federal Task Force had spent countless grueling hours desperately tracing these elusive digital ghosts, hoping they would finally lead to a secure physical location where the missing hostage was currently being held. Instead, the complex electronic trail definitively led to a suburban residence in California completely and utterly disconnected from the harsh physical reality of the original Arizona crime scene. This newly identified suspect had absolutely zero physical involvement in the actual violent disappearance. He possessed absolutely zero actionable knowledge regarding the current physical whereabouts of the missing elderly victim. At 84 years old, her daily routine was dictated not by social events or extravagant travel, but by a strict schedule. He simply saw a desperate, vulnerable family flashing across his television screen and allegedly decided to ruthlessly monetize their profound, unimaginable suffering. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of this alleged digital extortion scheme clearly highlights a deeply disturbing modern trend in high-profile criminal investigations. When a mysterious case garners massive national attention, it instantly creates a massive, volatile vacuum of verified information that opportunistic, malicious actors are incredibly eager to exploit and fill. The successful arrest of the accused digital extortionist was undoubtedly a significant technical victory for the specialized cyber division. But it simultaneously delivered a completely devastating psychological blow to the primary physical investigation. The dedicated federal agents had successfully neutralized a major investigative distraction, but in doing so, they were brutally forced to confront a truly terrifying and remarkably hollow truth. If the specific person aggressively demanding the Bitcoin was simply an opportunistic remote fraud living hundreds of miles away on the coast, then the real physical perpetrator was still actively out there, completely silent and completely undetected by law enforcement of prescription medications. And the slow, careful movements required of someone whose mobility was steadily declining. The threatening letters were a complete digital mirage. The aggressive cryptocurrency demands were absolutely nothing more than a remarkably cruel electronic illusion. Once the incredibly complicated digital layers of cryptocurrency fraud and heavily encrypted emails were finally and completely stripped away, the exhausted authorities found themselves right back exactly where they started on that very first tragic morning. They were standing virtually empty-handed, helplessly, staring at a completely cold physical trail. The horrifying realization that the actual physical kidnapper had never once reached out to make a single financial demand fundamentally shifted the entire behavioral psychological profile of the unknown primary subject. Why would an unknown someone carefully orchestrate such an incredibly high-risk tactical operation only to vanish entirely into the unseen shadows without ever asking for a single cent? The absolute sustained silence from the true original perpetrator is easily the most deafening and terrifying aspect of this entire ongoing tragedy. She spent her evenings inside the fortified comfort of her home, located in the affluent Catalina Foothills area. It strongly suggests a hidden motive deeply rooted in something far more intensely personal, or perhaps something entirely terrifyingly random and chaotic. The high-profile arrest effectively cleared the investigative board of all the false digital leads and confusing electronic noise, leaving behind only the stark, terrifying physical facts of the initial violent breach. The dedicated investigators were absolutely no longer hunting a greedy digital opportunist seeking a quick cryptocurrency payout. They were hunting a physical ghost who possessed the immense tactical discipline to perfectly execute a flawless physical extraction, and the terrifying psychological patience to never speak a single word about it afterward. The severe emotional whiplash of genuinely believing they were actively communicating with the captor, only to discover it was an elaborate, remote financial scam, left the local community reeling, and the authorities desperately scrambling to refocus their massive collective efforts. The formerly accused Californian extortionist is now currently facing severe federal legal charges for his alleged malicious interference, but his upcoming prosecution brings absolutely zero genuine comfort to those still desperately waiting for actual physical answers back in Arizona. Her world was small and contained, yet outside those walls, her name carried a massive implicit weight. We rely heavily on verifiable hard facts to carefully cut through exactly this kind of malicious online noise. So make sure you are actively subscribed to Ellis Case Reports to continuously support our rigorous forensic approach to true crime. As the turbulent spring months relentlessly marched forward, the intense media frenzy slowly began to subside, but the profound, agonizing emptiness left behind in the upscale Arizona neighborhood remained entirely unchanged. By the middle of April 2026, the local law enforcement agencies were officially forced to issue a deeply somber and highly discouraging public update. Despite the unprecedented national television attention, the exhaustive high-level federal involvement, and the complete tactical neutralization of the malicious digital interference, they still had absolutely no verified, actionable information regarding the actual physical location of the missing elderly woman. The massive multi-agency investigation, which had vigorously expanded across multiple state lines and reached deep into the darkest hidden corners of the encrypted internet, eventually contracted right back to the silent concrete threshold where it all originally began. The stark historical, statistical reality of unsolved missing persons cases, specifically involving extremely vulnerable elderly individuals, is incredibly. As the mother of prominent television host Nancy Guthrie, she inadvertently occupied a space that most elderly citizens never experience: unforgiving. And the seasoned forensic investigators fully understood the grim biological mathematics they were desperately fighting against every single day. A fragile human body, completely and suddenly deprived of essential daily maintenance medication, cannot simply endure indefinitely, regardless of the specific environmental conditions or the potential care provided during their forced captivity. The initial urgent rapid response rescue mission had slowly and quietly transitioned over several weeks into a completely different kind of methodical procedural operation. The dedicated physical search teams continued to meticulously comb through remote, harsh desert areas and relentlessly follow up on every single obscure anonymous tip line caller, but the prevailing atmosphere within the primary investigative command center had undeniably shifted from a frantic high-energy pursuit to a grim, exhausted determination. The local affluent community, which had initially rallied together in a powerful, unified show of neighborhood strength, gradually fell back into a deeply unsettling state of perpetual, lingering anxiety. They were brutally forced to reconcile with the terrifying, undeniable fact that an unknown, highly capable predator was still freely walking among them, completely unaccounted for, and potentially capable of striking again without any warning, the security footage does not capture a violent struggle or record a desperate scream. She was simultaneously an incredibly frail woman who needed constant daily care and a high-value target connected to enormous wealth and national influence. The heavy yellow police tape that once brightly cordoned off the targeted residence was eventually removed by authorities, leaving the quiet property looking deceptively normal to any casual observer driving down the peaceful street. But the profound psychological scar permanently inflicted upon the entire surrounding suburban area is absolutely indelible. Every single time a local resident locks their reinforced front door or anxiously checks their personal digital security system, they are involuntarily reminded of the silent, masked phantom who effortlessly bypassed those exact same standard defensive measures. The profound, agonizing lack of a definitive legal resolution creates a remarkably unique kind of prolonged psychological torture for the surviving traumatized family members who are brutally trapped in a terrible emotional purgatory, indefinitely unable to properly grieve and entirely unable to completely let go of their desperately thin, fading hope. The local judicial authorities remain officially committed to keeping the massive, complex case file active and fully open vigorously, refusing to prematurely relegate the unsolved violent disappearance to the dusty, forgotten archives of local cold cases just yet. They are still actively, patiently waiting for a tiny, microscopic break in the physical trace. Evidence, perhaps a newly discovered hesitant witness who finally decides. This jarring contradiction forms the absolute core of the terrifying events that would unfold. To bravely come forward, or a sudden, unprecedented technological advancement that might extract a new hidden clue from the original preserved crime scene data. But until that miraculous scientific breakthrough actually occurs, the entire investigation remains firmly anchored in a deeply frustrating, agonizing state of suspended animation. The terrifying absolute absence of any genuine, verifiable communication from the actual original perpetrator continues to cast an incredibly long, dark shadow over every single working theory proposed by the expert behavioral analysts. We are left endlessly contemplating the deeply disturbing, complex mechanics of a violent crime that was clearly executed with phenomenal tactical precision, but completely lacks any discernible, logical, financial purpose. The profound, absolute silence that immediately followed the physical abduction remains the absolute loudest and most terrifying piece of circumstantial evidence in the entire ongoing investigation. The unresolved case tragically stands as a chilling modern monument to the deeply unsettling reality that sometimes vulnerable people simply vanish entirely into the darkness, leaving behind absolutely nothing but an enduring, agonizing mystery. What this case teaches us about the digital exploitation of true crime is profoundly disturbing. When criminals plan an abduction for financial gain, they calculate the logistical difficulties of securing and keeping their target alive. Kidnapping a healthy adult is complex enough. We are witnessing the rapid evolution of parasitic extortion, where anonymous individuals aggressively leverage the vast reach of modern media to insert themselves into active tragedies. From a strict behavioral profiling perspective, these digital perpetrators do not share the psychological profile of violent kidnappers. They are opportunistic cybercriminals who utilize advanced encryption and cryptocurrency specifically to maintain absolute geographic distance from the physical danger of the actual crime scene. This terrifying dynamic forces specialized law enforcement to actively fight a massive, chaotic two-front war simultaneously. They must tirelessly pursue the physical ghost who violently breached the residential perimeter, while simultaneously battling a relentless swarm of digital vultures, actively seeking to monetize the resulting trauma. The critical analytical mechanism used by federal agencies to separate the genuine threat from the malicious noise is the absolute requirement for definitive proof of life. In professional hostage negotiations, an unverified electronic threat holds zero operational weight unless the anonymous sender can quickly produce highly specific biological evidence or completely guarded personal details that mathematically prove they physically possess the living victim. Without this crucial verification protocol, massive ongoing investigations would completely collapse under the crushing weight of fraudulent international demands. Abducting an 84-year-old woman with severe medical dependencies is a logistical nightmare that the profound tragedy of this specific unsolved disappearance violently exposes a deeply cynical reality regarding our globally connected modern society. The immense technological infrastructure designed to rapidly share critical information and facilitate global communication has unfortunately been fully weaponized to successfully execute remote psychological torture. The agonizing vulnerability of a desperate searching family is no longer just a terrible local tragedy. It has tragically become a highly lucrative target for invisible predators operating safely within the dark, anonymous corners of the digital world. The advanced technological systems and the sophisticated federal cyber division successfully apprehended the individual allegedly responsible for the cruel digital interference. But that specialized electronic victory offers absolutely zero closure regarding the original physical crime. The terrifying masked individual captured briefly in the harsh monochrome glare of the security footage remains completely unidentified and entirely free. That highly organized predator meticulously planned their calculated approach, flawlessly executed the swift extraction of an incredibly vulnerable target, and then seamlessly vanished completely into the desert night without ever demanding a single cryptocurrency payment. If the ultimate underlying motive was never actually driven by massive financial gain, then the community is forced to confront a much darker, unanswerable question. Practically guarantees the victim might succumb to the physical stress before any demands can be met. What exactly was the true purpose behind taking her away? The solitary lingering stain on the cold concrete remains the only honest witness to the horrific events of that silent evening. Thank you for thoroughly exploring the complex forensic reality of this deeply unsettling mystery with us today. Please remember to subscribe and join us next week as we carefully examine another highly complex, active case file, strictly relying on the verifiable physical evidence to uncover the absolute truth. Professional extortionists typically avoid this exact scenario because a deceased hostage drastically reduces the leverage required to extract a ransom. The person who began watching her house must have known this profound risk. They must have understood that removing her from her medication supply was essentially signing a death warrant from the very first minute. Despite this massive operational hazard, someone decided that the connection to a famous television personality made the extreme risk worthwhile. Throughout the month of January 2026, Nancy maintained her quiet domestic life, entirely unaware of the surveillance that was likely mapping her every move. It simply shows an unknown figure approaching a quiet residence in the upscale neighborhoods of Tucson, Arizona in the dead of night. She stayed indoors. She relied on her routine to navigate the physical difficulties of her advanced age. She prepared for the end of the week just as she always did, looking forward to the simple comforts of her faith and her community. Every single Sunday, she sat down in front of her computer to stream her regular church service. It was an unbreakable habit. It was a predictable anchor in a life that had grown increasingly restrictive. She relied on that digital connection to the outside world because physically attending large gatherings had become too difficult. That unwavering routine was the exact kind of predictable pattern a predator requires to finalize their timeline. The evening of January 31st came and went with no obvious signs of distress. The neighborhood remained perfectly calm. There were no alarms triggered. There were no frantic phone calls made to local authorities. The desert air settled heavily over her home as the darkness deepened. By the time the morning sun illuminated the street, an 84-year-old woman had vanished without leaving a single footprint. The false security of her locked doors offered no real protection against an adversary who had already calculated the layout, the timing, and the terrible physical cost of their plan. Her digital church service was scheduled to begin the following morning. The broadcast would start right on time, delivering hymns and prayers through the computer speakers into her living room, just as it always did. But when the virtual congregation gathered that Sunday morning, the screen in her home illuminated a completely empty room. The comforting sounds of the Sunday service played out to absolute devastating silence. That heavy silence was punctuated only by the grim reality of a dark red stain slowly drying on the concrete just outside her front door. The morning of February 1st, 2026 fundamentally altered the trajectory of the Guthrie family and launched one of the most agonizing investigations in modern local history. When Nancy failed to log into her online congregation, it immediately triggered a wave of intense concern among those who knew her rigid schedule. She did not pack a suitcase. She left behind her essential daily medications. She left behind her entire life. She was a woman of habit, and skipping her religious service without notifying anyone was entirely out of character. This sudden break in routine prompted an urgent request for a welfare check. Law enforcement officers arrived at the Catalina Foothills residence expecting to find a medical situation. They anticipated discovering an elderly woman who had perhaps suffered a severe fall or encountered a sudden debilitating health crisis inside her home. They were prepared to call paramedics and force entry to provide life-saving assistance. What they found instead instantly escalated the situation from a routine medical call to a major criminal investigation. The house was unnervingly still. There was no sign of forced entry at the primary access points, suggesting either a terrifying level of stealth or an interaction at the door. But the most alarming discovery was waiting for them directly on the front porch. A distinct, localized bloodstain marked the concrete surface. It was not a massive pool of blood, but the unmistakable biological signature of violence. Most missing persons cases involving the elderly stem from medical emergencies or accidental wandering. For an investigator evaluating a scene involving an 84-year-old resident, a bloodstain near the threshold is the ultimate red flag. It destroys the hypothesis of a peaceful, voluntary departure. Elderly individuals suffering from cognitive decline might wander away from their homes, but they do not typically leave blood on their own front step before disappearing into the desert. The physical evidence immediately told the responding officers that an injury had occurred precisely at the point of exit or entry. Someone had bled on that porch, and the homeowner was nowhere to be found. The interior of the house offered no immediate comfort. Her critical daily medications, the exact pharmaceutical lifeline she required to maintain her physical stability, were left behind. Her mobility aids remained at the property. The house was essentially a preserved snapshot of her life, right up until the exact moment someone forcibly interrupted it. Detectives quickly established a perimeter, treating the entire property as a high-priority crime scene. The dark red stain by the front door completely shatters that theory. Forensics teams arrived to document, photograph, and swab the blood evidence for immediate DNA analysis. The urgency of the situation was absolute. Every single law enforcement protocol dictates that the first 48 hours of a missing persons investigation are the most critical. But when the missing person is an octogenarian who has been separated from her necessary medication, that window of survival shrinks from hours down to minutes. The investigators knew they were not just looking for a kidnapper, they were racing against a biological clock that was rapidly running out. The air in the neighborhood grew thick with tension as unmarked police vehicles lined the street. Neighbors watched in shock as the reality of the situation began to materialize. The protective bubble of their secure community had been violently popped. Someone had managed to target, isolate, and extract an incredibly vulnerable woman right from under their noses. The immediate question shifted from where did she go to who took her. The officer standing over that single drop of blood recognized the terrifying level of calculation required to pull off such a crime. It turns a quiet disappearance into a highly calculated abduction. They understood that this was not a random act of street violence or a burglary gone wrong. Burglars run when they encounter residents. They do not kidnap 84-year-old women and transport them to unknown locations. This was a targeted operation. This was an extraction. And the perpetrators had managed to execute this nightmare scenario with a level of precision that left seasoned detectives staring at the pavement in disbelief. As the forensic technicians carefully collected the blood sample, the leading investigators realized that this was not a tragic accident. Somebody had intentionally taken her away, and the investigators needed to figure out exactly why someone would risk everything to steal a life that was already so fragile. They needed to find the invisible thread connecting this quiet street to a cold and calculated predator before it was too late. While the patrol units canvassed the immediate neighborhood looking for any witnesses who might have heard a disturbance, the lead investigators began pulling the digital security records from the victim-owned residence.